The red laser was an inch from his heart when I lunged. I'm just a black maid in a house full of killers. But that night, I was the only one brave enough to take a bullet for the Russian Mafia king. Now, the butcher of Moscow won't let me leave his bed, and he just told his men that if I try to run, he'll burn the entire city to find me. I saved his life. But did I just lose my soul? If you're here for the danger and the passion, subscribe and like this video right now. Question for you. Would you fake an engagement with a Russian mobster to save your family? Type "do it" or "run" below. All right, let's get into the story. I never meant to end up in Moscow. That's what I tell myself when the guilt sits heavy in my chest at 3 in the morning, when I can't sleep because the silk sheets smell like him, smoke and cedar and something darker I don't have a name for. I never meant to become invisible in a house full of men who kill for sport. I never meant to throw my body between a monster and a bullet. But intention stopped mattering the moment I saw that red dot trembling on Nikolai Volkov's chest, and my feet moved before my brain could catch up. Detroit was supposed to be temporary. The auto plants had closed, Mama's medical bills were drowning us, and my little brother Marcus, Marcus, he'd gotten himself tangled up with people who didn't forgive debt. I took the job posting I found on some sketchy international employment website because the money was incomprehensible. Domestic worker for a wealthy Russian family. Room and board included. Salary that would clear Mama's cancer treatment in 6 months and maybe get Marcus out of whatever hole he dug himself into. They didn't tell me the wealthy Russian family was the Volkov bratva. They didn't tell me I'd be cleaning blood off marble floors more often than dusting bookshelves. The flight to Moscow was 17 hours of cramped recycled air, and my mind spinning through worst-case scenarios that it didn't even come close to the truth. I'd never left the country before, never even left the Midwest except for one sad trip to Ohio for my grandmother's funeral. And here I was, 26 years old, stepping off a plane into January cold that felt like knives against my skin, where the Cyrillic letters on every sign looked like puzzles I'd never solve, where my brown skin stood out like a beacon in a sea of pale faces. The car they sent for me was black, naturally. Everything in Nikolai Volkov's world was black or red or the color of old money. Burgundy leather and dark wood and gold that had been in family vaults since before the revolution. The driver didn't speak, just held up a sign with my name spelled wrong and loaded my 2 suitcases into a trunk that could have fit a body. I'd learned later that it had, many times. The Volkov estate sat on the outskirts of Moscow proper. A compound, really, walls too high to see over and security that would make the Pentagon jealous. The house itself was something out of a dark fairy tale. Stone and iron and windows that reflected back your own face like accusations. I remember thinking it looked like a place where bad things happened behind closed doors. I remember thinking I'd just stay quiet, do my work, send money home, and get out before I learned too much. I was naive enough to believe I could be invisible. The head of staff, Irina Dmitrievna, was a woman carved from ice and Soviet-era discipline. She looked at me like I was a stain on her perfectly pressed uniform, her mouth pinching tight when she handed me my own. Plain black dress, white apron, shoes that would hurt my feet by the end of the first day. She spoke English with an accent that could cut glass, and she made it clear through the way she breathed that I was an inconvenience, an oddity, something that didn't belong in the careful order of her household. The rules were simple, she told me, as she walked me through corridors that seemed to stretch forever. I would clean the West Wing, the formal rooms, the spaces where business was conducted. I would be silent. I would be efficient. I would not speak unless spoken to. I would not meet the eyes of any of the men who came and went at all hours. I would not ask questions. I would pretend I didn't see what I saw, didn't hear what I heard, didn't understand even when I did. "And Mr. Volkov?" I asked, because even then I couldn't help myself, couldn't help pushing just a little against the boundaries they drew around me. Irina's face went even colder, which I didn't think was possible. She said his name like a prayer or a curse. I couldn't tell which. Nikolai Sergeyevich Volkov, the butcher of Moscow, though no one called him that to his face. The Pakhan, the boss, the king of an empire built on violence and blood loyalty and secrets that could topple governments. I would see him rarely, she said. He preferred his privacy. When I did see him, I would make myself scarce. I met him 3 hours later. I was on my knees scrubbing at a wine stain on the parquet floor of what they called the Red Room, where the Bratva held court, where deals were made and betrayals were punished. When the doors opened and the air itself seemed to change temperature. I felt him before I saw him, the way you feel a storm coming, a pressure in your skull and a tightening in your chest. His footsteps were quiet for a man his size. He moved like violence contained in an expensive suit, and when I made the mistake of glancing up, I understood why grown men with guns feared him. Nikolai Volkov was beautiful, the way a blade is beautiful. Sharp angles and cold eyes the color of winter sky, blonde hair cut military short, a jaw that looked like it had never softened even in sleep. He had scars, a thin white line through his left eyebrow, another along his neck that disappeared into his collar. His hands were tattooed with symbols I'd later learn told the story of his life in the code of the Vor Visakoni, the thieves-in-law, the brotherhood that ran in his blood. He stopped when he saw me, just stopped, his pale eyes tracking over my face, my body folded on the floor, the scrub brush still in my hand. I should have looked away. Irina had been clear, but something in me, some stupid, stubborn thing that had gotten me in trouble my whole life, kept my gaze steady. "The new girl," he said, not a question. His voice was deep and rough, accented in a way that made English sound almost dangerous. "From America." I nodded. My tongue felt thick in my mouth. He studied me for a long moment, long enough that my knees started aching against the hard floor, long enough that I wondered if this was some kind of test I was failing. Then he said something in rapid Russian to the men behind him. I hadn't even noticed them, 3 shadows in dark suits, and walked past me like I'd already ceased to exist. That's how it was for 3 months. I cleaned rooms that smelled like cigar smoke and expensive liquor. I served tea to men who spoke in code and looked through me like I was furniture. I learned to read the temperature of the house by the sound of footsteps, by how loudly the doors closed, by whether Nikolai's office lights stayed on past midnight. I learned that when the house went too quiet, something bad had happened or was about to happen. I learned to keep my head down and my mouth shut and my observations to myself. I learned that invisibility was a kind of armor, but also a kind of cage. Marcus called every Thursday. I could hear Detroit in the background of our conversations, sirens and bass from someone's car stereo, and Mama's voice calling him to dinner. He sounded good, he told me. Things were looking up. He'd found work, legitimate work, at a warehouse. He was staying clean, staying out of trouble. I wanted to believe him so badly that I ignored the edge in his voice, the way he sometimes paused too long before answering simple questions. I sent money home every week, watched my bank account fill and empty and fill again, counted down the days until I could leave this cold country and its colder people, until I could go back to a world where I understood the rules and didn't have to pretend I didn't see the blood. But I did see it. God, I saw so much blood. The first time someone died in front of me, it was in the entrance hall on a Tuesday morning. I was polishing the massive mirror that hung above the table where they left keys and guns and sometimes envelopes that I knew better than to touch. I heard the shouting first, Russian, angry, the kind of anger that precedes violence. Then a man I'd never seen before was dragged in by 2 of Nikolai's guards, his face already pulped, begging in words I didn't understand, but in a tone that was universal. Nikolai came down the stairs slowly. He was wearing black slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and I could see the tattoos that covered his forearms, Orthodox crosses and stars, and 8-pointed roses that meant something in the language of Russian prisons. He looked calm. That's what terrified me. The absolute calm in his face as he walked up to the man who was now sobbing, pleading. I should have left the room. That's what Irina would have told me. But I was frozen, my hand still holding the cloth, my reflection in the mirror watching like a witness to something unholy. Nikolai spoke quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the effect. The man's face going from desperate hope to resignation to absolute terror in the span of 3 seconds. Then Nikolai nodded once, just once, and walked away. The gunshot came before he'd even reached the stairs. I didn't scream. Something in me had locked down, some survival instinct that knew screaming would make me visible, would make me complicit, would make me next. I just stood there while they dragged the body out, while someone else came with a mop and bucket, while the day continued like a man hadn't just been executed 15 feet from where I stood. That night I vomited until there was nothing left, sat on the bathroom floor of my small room in the staff quarters, and shook so hard my teeth chattered. I should have left then, should have packed my bags and called the embassy and taken whatever punishment Marcus faced back home. But Mama's medical bills were still there. Marcus's promises were still shaky. And I was already in too deep, already compromised by every day I'd chosen to stay. That's the thing about sliding into darkness. It happens slowly enough that you don't notice until you can't see the light anymore. Nikolai noticed me watching that day. I didn't realize it until a week later when he stopped him in the hallway outside his office where I was cleaning a window, and he looked at me with those winter eyes and said, "You did not run." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway, my voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir." Why? I didn't know how to explain debt and duty and desperation in a language that wasn't quite mine, in a house where truth was currency I couldn't afford. So I just said, I needed to finish my work. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite approval, something else that made my stomach tighten. Then he walked away, and I stood there wondering what I'd just done, what door I'd just opened without meaning to. He started seeing me after that, not looking through me, but at me. He'd pause when he passed in the corridors, his gaze following me in a way that made my skin prickle. Sometimes he'd say something and rush into his men, and they'd laugh or nod, and I'd wonder what he was saying, whether I should be afraid or flattered or both. Once he asked me in that rough-edged English how I was finding Moscow, and I told him it was cold, and he almost smiled. Almost. "It suits you," he said. "The cold." I didn't know what he meant. Still don't, really. The night everything changed was a Friday in late March. Moscow was starting to thaw, the snow turning to gray slush. The kind of in-between weather that makes you forget what warmth feels like. There was a meeting that night, important enough that the house had been buzzing with preparation all day. Extra guards, the good vodka brought up from the cellar, Irina barking orders like a general preparing for war. I was supposed to stay in the kitchen, to help with food service but remain out of sight. That was the protocol for big meetings. The men didn't want to see the help, didn't want to be reminded that their secret business had witnesses. But one of the other girls was sick, and Irina grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and hiss that I'd have to bring the drinks to the red room, that I'd have to serve these men who scared her even after 20 years in this house. I carried the tray with my hands shaking. Crystal glasses full of vodka that cost more than my monthly salary, arranged on silver that had probably been stolen from nobility during the Revolution. The red room was thick with smoke and tension when I entered. Men in expensive suits with expensive watches and inexpensive morals, talking in low voices about things I didn't want to understand. Nikolai sat at the head of the table, like a king on a throne. He saw me immediately, his eyes tracking my movement as I served drinks, as I tried to be invisible and competent at the same time. I felt exposed under his gaze, like every thought in my head was written on my skin. I was serving the last glass when I saw it, the red dot, small and precise, dancing across Nikolai's white shirt, settling right over his heart. Time did something strange then, slowed down and sped up simultaneously. I saw the window across the room, open just a crack for the smoke to escape. Saw the angle of the laser sight. Understood with crystal clarity that someone outside had a rifle trained on him, that in the next second he would be dead, that all these dangerous men with their guns and their violence wouldn't be fast enough to stop it. My body moved before my mind could catch up, before I could think about what I was doing or why. I dropped the tray, heard the crystal shatter, vodka spraying across expensive wood, and threw myself forward, Felt my shoulder connect with Nikolai's chest, the solid warmth of him. Felt us both falling as the window exploded inward, and something hot punched through my side like a fist made of fire. I hit the ground hard, Nikolai's body beneath mine, his hands coming up instinctively to catch me. The pain was immediate and enormous, stealing my breath, turning my vision white at the edges. I could hear shouting, gunfire, chaos erupting around us. Could feel warmth spreading across my maid's uniform, soaking the cheap fabric. Nikolai's face was above me, his eyes wide with something I couldn't name. Shock, maybe, or fury. His hands were on me, pressing against my side where the warmth kept spreading, where I could feel my life leaking out onto his expensive floor. He said something in Russian, sharp and commanding. Then his face was closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of darker blue in his pale eyes. Could smell his cologne mixing with the copper scent of my own blood. His hand came up to my face, fingers surprisingly gentle against my cheek. "Stay with me," he said in English, his accent thicker with urgency. "Don't close your eyes. Look at me. Stay." But the darkness was already pulling at me, heavy and soft and almost comforting. I thought about Mama, about Marcus, about Detroit, and how far away it seemed now. Thought about how stupid I'd been, how dying in Moscow for a man I barely knew wasn't supposed to be part of the plan. Thought about how I'd never know if Marcus made it out, if Mama would be okay, if any of the money I'd sent would be enough. The last thing I remember was Nikolai's voice, harsh and desperate in a way that didn't match the man I thought I knew, saying my name like a prayer or a command, like he could hold me to this world through sheer force of will. Then nothing. I woke up 3 days later in silk sheets that smelled like cedar and smoke and him. The room was dark, heavy curtains blocking out whatever time of day it was. My side was on fire, wrapped tight in bandages that restricted my breathing. There was an IV in my arm, beeping machines I couldn't name, and when I tried to sit up, a hand pressed firmly against my shoulder, keeping me down. Nikolai was sitting in a chair beside the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at me with an intensity that made me wish I could disappear back into unconsciousness. He hadn't shaved in days, his jaw rough with stubble. His shirt was wrinkled. There were dark circles under his eyes that said he hadn't slept. And his hand on my shoulder was gentle in a way that somehow scared me more than his violence ever had. "You took a bullet for me," he said, his voice rough like broken glass. I tried to speak, but my throat was desert dry. He seemed to understand, reaching for a glass of water on the nightstand, helping me drink with a carefulness that didn't match his reputation. When I could finally speak, my voice came out cracked and small. "Your guards were supposed to. My guards failed." Something dark crossed his face. "They did not see the threat. You did." The words hung between us, heavy with implication. I didn't know what to say, how to explain that I'd acted on instinct, that I hadn't thought about loyalty or duty or anything except that red dot, and how wrong it seemed for him to die right then, right there before I understood who he really was. He studied my face like he was trying to solve an equation. Then he said something that changed everything, his accent thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Your life belongs to me now." I should have been afraid, should have recognized the trap closing around me, the cage replacing the invisibility I'd hidden behind. But I was too tired, too hurt, too confused by the gentleness in his tattooed hands as he adjusted the blanket around my shoulders. "I don't understand," I whispered. "You bled for me." He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. In my world, that means something. That means everything. He leaned back, his eyes never leaving mine. "You are no longer a maid in my house. You will not scrub floors or serve drinks or make yourself invisible. You are under my protection now. Anyone who touches you touches me." The weight of those words settled on my chest heavier than the bullet wound. I thought about running, about calling the embassy, about any escape route that might still exist. But something in his eyes told me those doors had already closed, that the moment I'd thrown myself between him and that bullet, I'd made a choice I couldn't unmake. "What about my family?" I managed to ask. "They will be taken care of." He said it like a vow. "Your mother's medical care, your brother's situation, all of it. You saved my life. I do not forget debts." Marcus. He knew about Marcus. Of course he did. Men like Nikolai Volkov didn't survive by being ignorant of threats, and the sister of a man in debt was always a potential liability. I wondered how long he'd known, whether my invisibility had been an illusion all along. I closed my eyes, exhaustion pulling at me, despite the fear trying to keep me alert. When I opened them again, Nikolai was still there, watching me with that unsettling focus, like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve but was determined to understand. "Rest," he said, and there was something almost soft in the command. "We will talk more when you are stronger." But as I drifted back into medicated sleep, I heard him say something else in Russian, soft enough that maybe I imagined it, something that sounded like a confession or a warning or a promise I wasn't ready to understand. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of pain medication and Nikolai's constant presence. He was always there when I woke, sometimes working on his laptop in the chair by the window, sometimes sleeping with his head tipped back and his face softer than I'd ever seen it. Once just standing at the window looking out at Moscow, like he was searching for threats even walls and guards couldn't keep out. A doctor came twice a day, an older man who spoke little and worked efficiently, checking my wound and changing bandages, while Nikolai watched every movement like he was prepared to kill if the doctor caused me unnecessary pain. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing anything vital by centimeters. "Lucky," the doctor said in broken English. "Incredibly lucky." Nikolai's response was something harsh in Russian that made the doctor go pale. Irina came once, her face carefully blank as she stood in the doorway and took in the scene. Me in the master's bed, surrounded by luxury I'd only cleaned before. Nikolai treating me like I was made of something precious instead of easily replaceable. She said something to him in Russian, her tone questioning, maybe disapproving. His response was short and cold, and she left without looking at me again. I learned later that he'd fired half his security team, that he'd had the man who'd taken the shot tracked down and dealt with in ways that made even his most hardened men uncomfortable, that he'd spent 3 days and nights at my bedside while his empire ran itself, while his enemies circled, while his world continued without his attention because he was too busy making sure I didn't die. "Why?" I asked him on the 4th day, when the pain had dulled enough for me to think clearly. "Why does this matter so much?" He was quiet for a long time, his pale eyes studying me from his chair by the window, Moscow's gray light making him look almost ethereal, almost unreal. "In my world," he finally said, "loyalty is currency. Betrayal is expected. Everyone wants something. Everyone has a price. Everyone lies." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. "You had no reason to save me. No loyalty I had earned. No debt I had paid. You should have let the bullet hit. Should have stayed invisible and safe. But you didn't." "I didn't think." "Exactly." Something that might have been a smile touched his mouth. "You did not think. You just moved. That kind of instinct. I have only seen it in men who have sworn blood oaths, in brothers who would die for each other. Never in—" He trailed off looking for the word. "A maid," I supplied bitterly. "A stranger," he corrected. "Someone I had not earned." There was something in his voice, something raw and almost vulnerable that didn't match the butcher of Moscow, the man I'd seen execute someone without flinching. It scared me more than his violence ever had, this glimpse of something human beneath the monster. "I don't want to belong to you," I said, because even medicated and trapped in his bed, I couldn't help pushing against boundaries. "I don't want to be owned." "Then what do you want?" He leaned back, watching me. "To go back to scrubbing floors? To being invisible? To sending money home while your brother throws it away and your mother dies slowly in a country that does not care if she lives or dies?" The truth of it stung worse than the bullet wound. He'd done his research, knew exactly where my pressure points were, knew how to make me see the cage I'd already been in before he ever made me visible. "I want to choose," I whispered. "Then choose." He stood up, walked to the window, his back to me. The light caught the scars on his neck, the tattoos on his hands. "Stay or go. Be visible or be invisible. But know that if you stay as yourself, not as something less. I do not keep pets. I have associates, equals, people who matter. I'm not a criminal. Neither was I once." He glanced back at me, something dark in his expression. "We all make choices, and then those choices make us." I closed my eyes, feeling the pull of sleep again. Or maybe just the pull of avoiding a decision I wasn't ready to make. But before I drifted off, I heard myself say, "I need to call my family. They'll be worried." "Your brother knows you are safe," Nikolai said. I had my people contact him. Something cold slid down my spine. "What did you tell him?" "That you were injured in an accident, that your medical care is covered, that his debts have been absorbed into a larger organization." His voice was carefully neutral. He was very relieved. I bet he was. Marcus always had been good at accepting help without asking what it would cost. When I woke again, it was dark, and Nikolai was gone. But there was a phone on the nightstand, and when I picked it up, I saw a text already typed out in English. "Tell them you are safe. Tell them you have a new job. Tell them nothing else." My hands shook as I called home. Mama answered on the second ring, her voice thick with worry and relief. She talked over me, questions spilling out about where I'd been, whether I was okay, what had happened. I did what Nikolai told me. Said there'd been an accident, nothing serious, that I was recovering. That I had a new position with the family, better pay, more responsibility. That I'd be staying in Moscow longer than planned. "You sound different, baby," she said, and I could hear her frowning through the phone. "You sound tired." "It's just the medication," I lied. "I'm fine, Mama. I promise." But we both knew I was lying. Some things you can't hide, even across an ocean and a phone line. Some things sit in your voice like stones. Marcus got on the line before we hung up, his voice too bright, too eager. He thanked me for the help, for always having his back. Said things were really turning around now, that he had opportunities, that everything was going to be okay. I wanted to warn him, wanted to tell him that money from men like Nikolai came with hooks you couldn't see until they were already buried in your flesh. But what would I say? That I'd learned that lesson while bleeding on his floor? That I was learning it now, in his bed, in his web? "Stay safe, Marcus," I said instead. "Please, just be careful." "Always am, sis. Always am." We hung up, and I sat there in the dark holding the phone, feeling the distance between who I'd been and who I was becoming, wondering if it was already too late to bridge that gap. Nikolai came back an hour later with food. Real food, not hospital bland nonsense, but dark bread and butter and soup that smelled like home, even though it was nothing like Mama's cooking. He sat in his chair and worked on his laptop while I ate. The silence between us, strangely comfortable, like we'd established some kind of rhythm I didn't remember agreeing to. "Your mother sounded well," he said without looking up from his screen. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. "You were listening?" "I needed to know you would follow instructions." Still not looking at me. "That you understood the situation." The anger that flared in my chest was clean and sharp. "You don't trust me. I don't trust anyone." Finally, he glanced up, his pale eyes meeting mine. "But I am learning to make exceptions." "How generous," I said, the sarcasm bitter on my tongue. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "You have fire. I like that. Most people, when they are afraid, they become small, quiet. But you," he closed his laptop, giving me his full attention. "You push back, even here, even now. Would you prefer I didn't?" "I would prefer you to be honest." He stood, walked to the bed, sat down on the edge carefully, like he was worried about jarring my injury. Up close like this, I could see the individual scars on his face, the slight crook in his nose from an old break, the way his jaw was set like he was always braced for impact. I do not need another person who says yes to everything. I need someone who will tell me the truth. The vulnerability in that statement caught me off guard. This man who ruled through fear and violence, asking me, of all people, to be honest with him. It felt like a trap and an opportunity at the same time. The truth is, I'm afraid of you, I said quietly. The truth is, I don't understand why you care if I live or die. The truth is, I don't know if staying here is survival or surrender. He absorbed that without flinching, his expression thoughtful. Then he reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away and touch my cheek with his tattooed hand. His palm was warm, his touch gentle, despite the violence those hands had committed. I'm afraid too, he said in Russian, then repeated it in English when he saw my confusion. I am afraid too, of what you make me feel, of what I will do to keep you safe, of how far I will go to keep you here. His thumb brushed my cheekbone, and I should have pulled away, should have reminded both of us about boundaries and power and the impossibility of anything real between a monster and a maid. But I was tired and hurt and lonely in a way I'd never admitted even to myself, and his touch felt like the first warm thing I'd felt since arriving in this cold country. This is a bad idea, I whispered. Yes, he agreed, very bad. But neither of us moved away. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, until someone knocked sharply on the door, and Nikolai's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The softness gone, replaced by cold authority. He barked something in Russian, and one of his men entered, speaking quickly, urgently. I caught the word bratva and the word problem, and saw Nikolai's jaw tighten. He stood, straightening his shirt, his face becoming the mask I was more familiar with. I have business to attend to. You will rest. Do not leave this room. I'm not a prisoner, I said, but we both knew I was testing boundaries I didn't fully understand yet. He looked back at me from the doorway, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. No, but there are people who would use you to get to me now. People who saw what you did, who understand what you mean. Until I have dealt with them, you stay where I can protect you. Then he was gone, and I was alone in his bed, in his room, in his world, trying to figure out when exactly I'd stop being invisible and become the most visible thing in his life. I healed slowly over the next 2 weeks, my body knitting itself back together, while my understanding of my new reality grew clearer and more terrifying. Nikolai was true to his word. My maid's uniform was gone, replaced by clothes I'd never have bought myself. Soft and expensive, and somehow exactly my style, even though I'd never told him what that was. A woman came to alter them to fit properly, her measuring tape and pins professional and impersonal, never once meeting my eyes like maybe I'd become as dangerous as he was through proximity alone. My room in the staff quarters was emptied. My few possessions appeared in his suite, unpacked and arranged by invisible hands. When I tried to protest, Nikolai simply said that the West Wing was being renovated, that the staff quarters were no longer secure, that this was temporary until better arrangements could be made. We both knew he was lying. We both knew I wouldn't be leaving. The nights were the strangest. He'd come in late, smelling of smoke and sometimes blood, would check on me like it was a ritual he couldn't break, would ask how I was feeling in that rough voice that did strange things to my pulse. Sometimes he'd sit in his chair and work, his presence a solid weight in the darkness. Sometimes he'd stand at the window looking out at Moscow like he was counting enemies. Once I woke to find him asleep in the chair, his face relaxed in a way I'd never seen while he was conscious. And I understood that he was exhausted in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. He was guarding me, personally, like he didn't trust anyone else to keep me safe. You're going to kill yourself, I said one night when he came in at 3 a.m, his eyes red-rimmed and his shoulders tight with tension. He paused in the act of loosening his tie, looking at me in the darkness. Concerned for me? You saved my life by keeping me alive. Seems stupid to let you die of exhaustion. Something that might have been a smile touched his mouth. Your logic is sound. He disappeared into the bathroom, and I heard the shower running. Tried not to think about him in there. Tried not to picture the water running over tattooed skin and battle scars. But my mind was traitor to my common sense. Had been for days now, and when he emerged in just black sleep pants with his hair damp and his chest bare, I had to look away before he saw something in my face I wasn't ready to acknowledge. He got into bed beside me, not touching, a careful foot of space between us, but there nonetheless, close enough that I could feel his body heat, could hear his breathing even out as exhaustion finally claimed him. I lay there in the dark, hyper-aware of his presence, of how strange and intimate and terrifying this was. A week ago, I'd been invisible. Now I was sleeping next to a man who killed more people than I could count, who claimed ownership of my life, who looked at me sometimes like I was a puzzle he needed to solve or a treasure he needed to protect, and I couldn't tell which scared me more. "Thank you," I whispered, so quiet I didn't think he'd hear. But his hand found mine in the darkness, squeezed once, then let go. "Sleep," he murmured. "You are safe here." And the terrifying thing was, I believed him. Morning brought Irina with breakfast and a face full of disapproval that she didn't quite manage to hide. She set the tray down with more force than necessary, her eyes taking in Nikolai's side of the bed, the rumpled sheets, the careful space between where he'd slept and where I lay. She said something in Russian that sounded like a question or maybe a judgment. Nikolai answered without opening his eyes, his voice rough with sleep and absolutely final. She left without another word, her spine rigid with whatever she was feeling but couldn't express. The wound healed but left a scar, puckered and pink on my dark skin. A permanent reminder of the night I stopped being invisible. I caught Nikolai looking at it sometimes when I changed bandages, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight like he was angry at the bullet for daring to mark me. Once he touched it, just his fingertips tracing the edges with a gentleness that made my breath catch, and said something in Russian too quiet for me to hear. I asked him to teach me the language. If I was going to survive in his world, I needed to understand what people were saying when they thought I couldn't follow. He looked surprised when I asked, then thoughtful, then something else I couldn't name. "It is not an easy language," he warned. "Nothing about this is easy," I replied. So he taught me. Mornings over breakfast, him correcting my pronunciation with patience I didn't know he possessed, writing out Cyrillic letters on paper and making me practice until my hand cramped. Evenings when he had time, testing my vocabulary, making me repeat phrases until I got the accent right. He was a demanding teacher, but I was a stubborn student, and slowly, painfully, the sounds started making sense. The letters stopped looking like puzzles. The conversations around me became less opaque. The first time I understood one of his men making a crude joke about me in Russian, I responded in the same language. My accent terrible, but my meaning clear. The man went pale. Nikolai laughed. Actually laughed. A sound I'd never heard from him before. Dark, ingenuine, and somehow young. "You have been listening," he said with something like pride in his voice. "Always," I replied in Russian, and watched his eyes darken with an intensity that had nothing to do with language lessons. The balance between us shifted after that, became something more complicated than captor and captive, more dangerous than protector and protected. He started asking my opinion on things. Small things at first, what I thought of a business associate's truthfulness, whether I'd noticed something off about a new guard. Then bigger things, strategies and alliances, and problems that would have gotten me killed for knowing about a month ago. "Why do you trust me?" I asked him one night when he'd shown me documents that could bring down half his organization if they fell into the wrong hands. He was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying my face in the dim light of his office. "Because you have not lied to me yet. Because when you look at me, you see the monster, but you do not look away." He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes. "And because I am tired of being surrounded by people who only tell me what I want to hear." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me, and it scared me how much I wanted to be worthy of that honesty. But Moscow had other plans. It always did. The first attack came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after I'd taken the bullet. I was strong enough to walk the grounds now, restless from being cooped up inside, craving air that didn't smell like expensive cologne and cigar smoke. Nikolai had guards assigned to me, 2 men who followed at a discreet distance, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. I hated it and understood the necessity in equal measure. The gardens were beautiful in the weak spring sunlight, snow melting into mud, the first brave green shoots pushing through frozen ground. I was standing by the fountain, watching ice crack and shift in the water, when I heard the first guard shout a warning. Then gunfire, close and sudden, shattering the morning quiet. My body remembered before my mind caught up, dropped low, moved toward cover behind the fountain's stone base. I could hear the guards returning fire, could hear tires screeching somewhere beyond the walls, could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The bullet wound in my side pulled with the movement, a sharp reminder that I wasn't as healed as I thought. It was over in less than a minute. One guard dead, the other injured but standing, the attackers fled or eliminated, and Nikolai running across the lawn with his gun drawn and his face showing more emotion than I'd ever seen. Raw fear and fury mixing into something that made him look almost wild. He reached me, his hands on my face, my shoulders, checking for injuries with fingers that shook slightly. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "I'm fine," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm okay." But he pulled me against his chest anyway, his heart hammering against my cheek, his arms wrapped around me like he could shield me from the whole world through sheer force of will. I felt him breathing hard, felt the tension in every muscle, felt something shift in the air between us that we'd both been trying to ignore. "This is because of me," he said into my hair, his accent thicker with emotion. "They target you to hurt me. I should have. Don't." I pulled back enough to look at his face, at the guilt and anger warring in his expression. "Don't you dare apologize for keeping me alive." Something in his eyes cracked open then, some wall he'd been maintaining crumbling under the weight of whatever he was feeling. He cupped my face in his tattooed hands and kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate and claiming, and tasted like fear and relief and something darker I didn't have a name for. I should have pushed him away, should have remembered all the reasons this was impossible, dangerous, wrong. But I kissed him back instead, my hands fisting in his shirt, pouring 3 weeks of confusion and terror and unwanted desire into the press of lips and tongue and teeth. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine and said something in Russian that sounded like a prayer or a curse. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It means I am fucked," he replied in English. And despite everything, the dead guard, the attack, the impossibility of us, I almost laughed. Everything changed after that kiss. The careful distance we'd maintained evaporated, replaced by a tension that crackled in every room we shared. He still slept beside me most nights, but now his arm would sometimes end up around my waist, my back pressed against his chest. Both of us pretending it was accidental, even though we knew better. His touches lingered, a hand on my lower back guiding me through doorways, fingers brushing mine when he handed me things, his thumb tracing my bottom lip when I was talking, and he was supposed to be listening. We didn't talk about it. Talking would make it real, would force us to acknowledge what was building between us and all the reasons it couldn't work. So we existed in this strange limbo, this space between denial and acceptance, while Moscow grew colder and more dangerous around us. Marcus called more frequently now, his voice always a little too bright, a little too eager. He talked about opportunities and connections and how grateful he was for my help. I tried to read between the lines, tried to figure out what exactly he was doing with the freedom Nikolai's absorption of his debts had bought him. But Marcus had always been good at hiding the truth behind smiles and promises. "Your brother is working for me now," Nikolai told me one evening, his voice casual like he was commenting on the weather instead of revealing something that made my blood run cold. I stared at him across the dinner table, fork frozen halfway to my mouth. What? He came to Moscow 2 weeks ago, said he wanted to help, to earn his way, to prove he was worth the investment I made in his debt. Nikolai sipped his vodka, his pale eyes watching my reaction carefully. I gave him simple work, running messages, making deliveries. Nothing dangerous. You should have told me. I am telling you now. He's my brother, Nikolai. He's not cut out for this world. He'll get himself killed. Something flickered in his expression. Then perhaps you should talk to him. Make him understand the consequences of the choices he is making. But when I tried to call Marcus, he didn't answer. When I finally reached him 3 days later, he sounded different. Harder, more confident, speaking in phrases that sounded like they'd been borrowed from men who'd survived in this world longer than he'd been alive. He assured me he was fine, that he knew what he was doing, that this was his chance to finally be somebody. I wanted to scream at him that being somebody in the Bratva meant being expendable, meant being willing to kill and die for men who would forget your name as soon as you were buried. But I could hear it in his voice. He'd already decided, already committed, already traded one kind of debt for another. Be careful, I said instead, because what else could I say? Please, Marcus, just be careful. Always am, sis, he replied, and the lie sat heavy between us because we both knew he'd never been careful a day in his life. I hung up and found Nikolai watching me from the doorway, his expression unreadable. You knew this would happen, I said. Not quite an accusation, but close. I knew he would come, Nikolai acknowledged. Men like your brother, they cannot accept charity. They need to believe they are earning their freedom, even when that freedom is an illusion. He moved closer, his presence filling the space between us. I gave him the safest work I could, but he is ambitious, hungry to prove himself. Those qualities make men dangerous to themselves. You could send him home. I could, but he would just find another organization, one that would not be as careful with him. His hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing my bottom lip in that way that made my thoughts scatter. At least here I can watch him, protect him for your sake. Is that what this is? I pulled back, needing distance to think clearly. You're protecting him to keep me here? I am protecting him because you love him. Nikolai's voice was quiet but certain. And I am learning that what matters to you matters to me, even when it should not. The honesty in that statement stole my breath. This man who'd built an empire on violence and fear, admitting that I'd become something that mattered, that my pain could hurt him, that he'd bend his world to accommodate mine. This is insane, I whispered. Yes, he agreed, stepping closer again, backing me against the wall with the kind of controlled intensity that made my pulse race. But insanity is honest, at least. Better than pretending this is something it is not. His mouth found mine again, and this time there was no pretending it was about fear or relief or anything other than raw want. His hands mapped my body with a possessiveness that should have scared me, but instead made something in my core tighten with need. My fingers found the buttons of his shirt, his skin hot beneath the expensive fabric, the tattoos rough under my palms. We made it to his bedroom. Our bedroom now, really, since I hadn't slept anywhere else in weeks. He was careful with me, mindful of my healing wound, but there was nothing gentle about the way he took me apart with hands and mouth and the weight of his body against mine. I let myself drown in sensation and forget about consequences and impossibility and all the reasons this would end badly. After, lying in tangled sheets with his arm around me and Moscow's winter darkness pressing against the windows, he said something in Russian against my shoulder, his voice rough and vulnerable in a way I'd never heard. What does that mean? I asked, tracing the tattoo on his forearm. A rose with 8 points, symbol of the Vor v Zakoni. He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, it means you have ruined me for anyone else. It means I am yours, even though you did not ask to own me. I turned in his arms to look at his face, at the man who was supposed to be a monster, but kept showing me glimpses of something achingly human underneath. I don't want to own you. No, he agreed, his thumb tracing my collarbone. You want to be free, but freedom is not always safety, Malaya. Sometimes the cage is what keeps us alive. And if I'd rather be free and dead than safe and caged? Something dark and possessive flared in his eyes. Then I will make sure you stay alive long enough to change your mind. It should have been a threat. Maybe it was. But it also felt like a promise, like a vow, like something I'd been searching for without knowing it. Someone who would fight for me, even against myself. The war came for us on a night in late April when spring was finally winning its battle against winter. Nikolai had a meeting with the other Pakhans, the heads of Moscow's criminal families, to discuss territory and profit and the uneasy peace they'd maintained for 5 years. I wasn't supposed to go. Women didn't attend these meetings, didn't sit at the table where kingdoms were divided and death sentences were pronounced. But Nikolai looked at me over breakfast that morning and said, "Get dressed. You are coming with me tonight." I blinked at him, tea halfway to my lips. What? The other families, they need to see you, need to understand that you are not a weakness to exploit, but a line they do not cross. His voice was matter of fact, like he was discussing the weather instead of upending centuries of tradition. You will sit beside me. You will say nothing unless I ask you to speak, but you will be there. They will think exactly what I want them to think, that you are mine, that touching you means war with me. He stood, came around the table, tilted my chin up with one finger. And they will be right. The meeting was held at a restaurant Nikolai owned, closed for the night and filled with men who looked like they'd learned violence before they learned language. 5 other Pakhans sat around the table, each with their own guards standing in the shadows, each watching me with varying degrees of confusion, anger, or calculation. I wore black because Nikolai had chosen it for me. A dress that was elegant and understated, but clearly expensive. His way of stating without words that I was no longer the maid they might have heard about, but something else entirely. He introduced me simply, "This is mine. You will respect her as you respect me." The room went silent. I could feel the weight of their stares, could practically hear them trying to figure out what game Nikolai was playing, what weakness this represented. But he sat with absolute confidence, his hand on my thigh under the table, his body language daring any of them to challenge his decision. It was an older man who spoke first, his Russian heavily accented with something I later learned was Georgian. He said something that made several of the men laugh, something about Nikolai's taste becoming exotic. Nikolai's response was quiet and cold enough to ice the room. "Say something like that again, and I will cut out your tongue and feed it to you." The Georgian went pale. But another man, younger, hungry-eyed, watching me like I was a possession he wanted to take, leaned forward and spoke in English, clearly for my benefit. "She is the one who took the bullet, yes? The maid who became something more? She is the one who saved my life," Nikolai corrected, his accent hard. "While my own men failed, while you all sat safe in your houses, she bled for me. And now you keep her like a pet," the young Pakhan said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "How touching." I felt Nikolai tense beside me, felt the violence coiling in him like a spring about to release. And I understood suddenly what he was doing, why he'd brought me here. He was forcing them to acknowledge me, to make me real in their eyes, so that I would be protected by the same code that governed their world. But it was a gamble because tradition was powerful, and a black woman at this table violated every expectation they had about how their world worked. "I am not a pet," I said in Russian, my accent thick but my words clear. "I am a person who made a choice. I do not ask for your approval or your understanding, only your respect." The room went silent again, but this time it was different. Surprise instead of mockery, assessment instead of dismissal. The young Pakhan's smile faded. The Georgian looked at Nikolai with something that might have been grudging admiration. "She speaks," one of the other men said, not unkindly, "and she has fire." "Yes," Nikolai said, and his hand tightened on my thigh. Possession or pride, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. "She does." The rest of the meeting proceeded with business as usual, territories and percentages, and disputes that needed resolution. But I could feel the shift in how they looked at me, how they spoke around me. I'd passed some test I didn't know I was taking, earned some grudging place in their worldview by refusing to be invisible. We left 2 hours later, Nikolai's arm around my waist as we walked to the car, his guards flanking us on both sides. I could feel the adrenaline still singing in my veins, my heart racing with the risk I'd taken by speaking, by challenging their assumptions. "You did well," Nikolai said quietly as the car pulled away from the curb. "I didn't ask to be there." "No, but you rose to it anyway. That is the difference between surviving and living." He looked at me in the darkness of the car, Moscow's lights sliding across his face. "You could have stayed small, stayed silent, but you chose to be seen. I'm not sure that was smart. Smart is overrated. Brave is better." His hand found mine, his fingers lacing through mine in a gesture that felt absurdly tender given what we just left. "And you, Malaya, are the bravest person I have ever known." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I was just doing what I had to do to survive, that none of this was bravery so much as necessity. But the way he was looking at me made the words die in my throat, made me wonder if maybe bravery and necessity were the same thing seen from different angles. We made it 3 blocks before the first bullet shattered the window. The car swerved as our driver took evasive action, Nikolai's body covering mine instantly, pushing me down below the seat line while he barked orders in Russian. I couldn't follow through the adrenaline roaring in my ears. More bullets, the rear window exploding inward, showering us with glass. I felt wetness on my arm and couldn't tell if it was blood or just the melting snow they tracked in earlier. The car crashed, not hard enough to deploy airbags, but hard enough that my head cracked against something solid, hard enough that stars burst behind my eyes. Doors opening, hands grabbing me, pulling me from the wreckage. I fought on instinct, kicking, clawing, hearing Nikolai shouting my name mixed with gunfire and Russian curses. Then something hit me hard across the face, and the world tilted sideways, darkness crowding the edges of my vision. The last thing I saw was Nikolai reaching for me, his pale eyes wide with something I'd never seen there before. Fear, raw and unguarded, before rough hands dragged me into a different vehicle and Moscow's lights blurred into nothing. I woke up in darkness that smelled like mildew and blood. My head throbbed where I'd been hit. My wrists were bound with zip ties that bit into skin, and when I tried to move, pain lanced through my ribs on the side where the bullet wound was still healing. Someone had reopened it, either in the crash or the struggle after. Footsteps approached, and a light snapped on, harsh and industrial, making me squint against the sudden brightness. The young Pakan from the meeting stood in front of me, the one who'd called me Nikolai's pet, and his smile was as cold as Moscow winter. "Good," he said in English. "You are awake. We have much to discuss, you and I." His name was Dmitry Kozlov, and he explained everything with the casual certainty of someone who believed he'd already won. How he'd been waiting for Nikolai to show weakness, some vulnerability he could exploit. How my appearance at the meeting had confirmed what his spies had been reporting, that the butcher of Moscow had developed a conscience, a soft spot, a fatal flaw wrapped in brown skin and American accent. How he'd used my brother to feed him information about security, about movements, about exactly when and where we'd be most vulnerable. Marcus. My stomach turned to ice at the implications. "Your brother is quite useful," Dmitry said, circling me like a predator studying prey. "Eager to prove himself, hungry for approval, easy to manipulate. He does not even know he is helping me destroy you both." "Where is he?" My voice came out rough, my throat dry. "Safe for now. Whether he stays that way depends on how cooperative you choose to be." The plan was simple in its cruelty. I would record a video, tell Nikolai I was leaving willingly, that I couldn't live in his world anymore, that our relationship had been a mistake. I would beg him not to look for me, to let me go. Dmitry would send the video, and while Nikolai was reeling from the betrayal, distracted by grief or rage or whatever emotions the butcher of Moscow kept buried beneath his ice, Dmitry would strike, take territory, eliminate key men, dismantle the Volkov Empire piece by piece. And if I refuse, I asked, even though I already knew the answer, then I will hurt you in ways that will make you wish you had taken that bullet in the heart instead of the side. He crouched down in front of me, his eyes empty of anything resembling humanity. And then I will kill your brother slowly while you watch. And then I will kill you anyway, but not before sending Nikolai proof of what you suffered. He wasn't bluffing. I could see it in his eyes, in the casual way he spoke about torture and murder, like they were items on a grocery list. This was the world I'd stumbled into, the reality I'd been insulated from by Nikolai's protection. This was what it meant to matter to someone who had power. You became leverage, a weapon to be used against them. Your pain a currency in wars you never asked to fight. I need time to think, I said, buying seconds, minutes, anything to figure out a way out of this that didn't end with everyone I cared about dead. You have until morning, Dmitri said, standing. Then we make the video, or we start removing fingers. Your choice. He left me alone in the darkness, bound and bleeding, and trying not to panic. I thought about Nikolai, about the fear in his eyes when they pulled me from the car. Thought about Marcus, about how he'd been used without knowing it, how his hunger to prove himself had made him the perfect pawn. Thought about Mama back in Detroit, oblivious to how badly this had all gone wrong. Thought about the girl I'd been 6 months ago, stepping off a plane into Moscow winter, naive enough to believe she could stay invisible. Hours passed. I worked at the zip ties until my wrists bled, but they didn't budge. The wound in my side leaked fresh blood, warm and sticky, and I wondered with distant detachment if I'd bleed out before morning, if that would be mercy or cowardice. I prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore, bargained with whatever forces might be listening, promised things I had no power to deliver if only someone would help me find a way through this. The door opened again, but it wasn't Dmitri who walked in. It was Marcus. My brother looked older than the last time I'd seen him, harder around the eyes, moving with a confidence that seemed borrowed from men who'd worn it longer. He froze when he saw me, his expressions cycling through confusion to horror to something that might have been guilt. Jesus Christ, he breathed. Sis, what happened to you? You happened to me, I said, my voice flat with exhaustion and pain. You and your need to prove yourself to men who will use you up and throw you away. I don't understand. Dmitri said you were at a safe house, that Nikolai wanted you kept. Dmitri is using you, Marcus. He's been using you this whole time. Every piece of information you gave him, every detail about security or schedules or where I'd be, he used it to get to Nikolai through me. I watched my brother's face as understanding dawned, as the horror of what he'd done settled into his bones. He'd been played, and he'd helped them take me, and now he had to live with that. I didn't know, he whispered. God, sis, I swear I didn't know. It doesn't matter what you knew. What matters is what happens next. I met his eyes. My little brother who I'd crossed an ocean to save, who I'd taken a bullet to protect indirectly, who'd somehow become complicit in my nightmare. You need to get a message to Nikolai. Tell him where I am. Tell him Dmitri's plan. Tell him. I can't. They're watching me. If I leave, if I make a call, they'll know. Then untie me, I said urgently. Give me a chance to run. They'll kill me if you escape. They'll kill you anyway, Marcus. Once you're not useful anymore, once this is over, you're just a loose end. A witness who knows too much. I heard my voice breaking, felt tears I'd been holding back finally spilling over. Please, please, little brother, do this one right thing. He looked at me for a long moment, war playing out behind his eyes. Self-preservation versus loyalty, fear versus love. Then he moved, pulling a knife from his pocket, cutting through the zip ties with hands that shook. There's a door at the back, he said quietly. 2 guards, but they're watching the front. If you're fast, an alarm sounded, cutting him off. Footsteps, running, shouting in Russian. Marcus's face went white. Go, he hissed. Go now. I ran, ignoring the pain in my side, the dizziness from blood loss, the fear trying to paralyze me. Found the door Marcus had mentioned, slipped through into a narrow alley that smelled like garbage in desperation. Heard more shouting behind me, heard gunfire, heard Marcus screaming my name, or maybe just screaming. I ran through Moscow's underbelly, through streets I didn't know toward a destination I couldn't name. Used the Russian Nikolai had taught me to ask for help from a woman outside a closed shop. Used his name like a talisman, like a ward against the nightmare chasing me. She made a phone call with trembling hands, spoke quickly, gave me her coat even though it was too small and couldn't hide the blood. 20 minutes later, a black car pulled up, and Nikolai himself got out, his face showing more emotion than I'd ever seen. Relief and rage and fear, all fighting for dominance. He reached me in 3 strides, his hands on my face, checking for injuries, his eyes wild with something that looked almost like panic. "You are alive," he said in Russian, then English, then Russian again, like he needed to say it in both languages to believe it. "You are alive." Then he pulled me against him, his arms tight enough to hurt, his face buried in my hair, and I felt him shaking. This man who'd built an empire on violence and control, trembling like he'd come close to breaking. "Nikolai," I managed through my own tears. "Marcus, they have Marcus. He helped me escape, but they caught him. And Dimitri's going to—" "I know." His voice had gone cold, controlled, the man I knew returning as the emotions got locked back down. "I know where he is. I know what Dimitri planned, and I am going to burn his entire organization to the ground for touching you." He got me into the car, barked orders in Russian to his men, personally wrapped my bleeding side with a shirt stripped from one of his guards. The ride back to the estate was silent, except for his hands constantly finding me, checking my pulse, smoothing my hair, holding my hand like he needed the physical confirmation that I was real and alive and beside him. "I thought I had lost you," he said finally, quietly, his accent thick. "When they took you from the car, when I could not stop them, I thought—" He broke off, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. "I have lost people before. Many people. It is the cost of this life. But losing you would have unmade me. I'm here," I said, squeezing his hand. "I'm here, and I'm not leaving. But Nikolai, Marcus, we have to—" "I will get your brother back," he promised, and the absolute certainty in his voice made me believe him. "I will make Dimitri regret he was ever born, and then I will make sure this never happens again." The war started that night. Nikolai called his bratva together, men who'd sworn blood oaths, who'd killed and bled for him, who moved through Moscow like shadows with teeth. He stood in the Red Room where I'd first served him drinks, what felt like a lifetime ago, and he told them that Dmitri Kozlov had declared war by taking what was his, that there would be no mercy, no negotiation, no peace until Dmitri's organization was dust and his men were dead or running. I watched from the doorway as his men responded with a roar of approval, as they armed themselves with enough weapons to start a small war, as they became what they truly were, killers united by loyalty to a man who'd earned it through strength and blood, and an absolute refusal to forgive betrayal. "You should rest," Nikolai said, finding me in the doorway, his eyes still carrying that wild edge from the car. "You are hurt. You need—" "I need to be part of this," I interrupted. "He used my brother. He took me. He planned to use me to destroy you. I have a right to be there when you end him. It will be violent, ugly, not something you should—" "I've seen violence." I met his eyes, held his gaze. "I've bled for you, Nikolai. I've been beaten and bound and threatened. I'm not fragile and I'm not innocent anymore. So either I come with you or I follow on my own. Your choice." Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or respect, or that same wild possessiveness I'd seen in the car. Then he pulled me close, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm on my lips. "You are magnificent," he said in Russian. "Terrifying and magnificent and mine." "Yes," I agreed in the same language. "Yours and you are mine. So let's go get my brother and end this." The raid on Dimitri's warehouse was quick and brutal. Nikolai's men moved with practiced efficiency, overwhelming guards with superior numbers and better weapons. I stayed in the car like he'd made me promise, watching through tinted windows as the building lit up with muzzle flashes, as bodies fell, as Moscow's criminal underworld did what it did best, consume itself. Nikolai found Marcus in a basement room, beaten badly but alive, tied to a chair surrounded by evidence that Dmitri had planned to make good on his threats. My brother's face was swollen, his hands damaged in ways that made my stomach turn, but his eyes were clear when they brought him out, clear and full of shame and relief in equal measure. "I'm sorry," he sobbed when he saw me, the words spilling out between broken teeth. "God, sis, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand. I just wanted—" "I know," I said, holding him as carefully as his injuries allowed. "I know what you wanted, but that life, the one you were chasing? It doesn't exist, Marcus. It's a lie wrapped in money and power, and it will kill you. It almost killed both of us." Dmitri himself was brought before Nikolai in that warehouse, forced to his knees in the center of a room that smelled like blood and cordite. He still had that cold smile, even bleeding and beaten, even knowing he'd lost. "You think this ends it?" he spat at Nikolai. "You think protecting one woman makes you less of a monster?" "No," Nikolai said simply, his voice empty of emotion. "I know exactly what I am, but she makes me want to be less monstrous, and that is more than you will ever understand." He gave me the gun. I stared at it in my hands, felt the weight of it, the coldness of the metal, the absolute finality of what he was offering me. Justice, vengeance, the right to end the man who'd hurt me, who'd used my brother, who'd threatened everything I'd somehow started to build in this impossible place. "You do not have to," Nikolai said quietly. "I can do this for you." But I thought about the girl who'd stepped off the plane 6 months ago, who'd believed she could stay invisible, who thought suffering and silence was the same as strength. I thought about the woman I'd become, someone who'd taken a bullet, who'd challenged Pakans, who'd survived kidnapping and torture, and come out the other side still standing. I aimed the gun, my hand steadier than I expected, and I looked Dmitri in his empty eyes. "This is for using my brother," I said, "for threatening the people I love, for thinking I was weak enough to break." I pulled the trigger. The recoil jarred my shoulder, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Dmitri fell backward, his cold smile finally gone, replaced by nothing at all. I stood there holding the gun, feeling the weight of what I'd just done settle into my bones. I'd killed a man, ended a life, crossed a line I could never uncross. Nikolai's hand covered mine, gently taking the gun, his other arm coming around me from behind. "Breathe," he murmured against my ear. "Just breathe, Milaya." I did. In and out, while my hands started to shake and my stomach threatened to rebel. I'd thought it would feel different, more dramatic, more meaningful, more like justice, but it just felt heavy and final and irrevocable, like I'd carved something out of myself and could never put it back. "I need to leave," I whispered. "I need air." He got me out of there, away from the body and the blood and the men who looked at me now with something like respect or fear or both. Got me into the car where Marcus was already waiting, his damaged hands wrapped in makeshift bandages, his eyes hollow with shock. Neither of us spoke during the ride back to the estate. What was there to say? We'd both crossed into Nikolai's world completely now, had both paid the price of admission in blood and choices we couldn't take back. The days after were strange and surreal. The doctor came for both Marcus and me, stitching wounds and wrapping injuries and asking no questions about how we'd gotten them. Nikolai's organization absorbed the remnants of Dmitri's operation, eliminating those who'd been loyal to their dead Pakan and offering positions to those willing to switch allegiances. The other crime families watched and waited, taking measure of how thoroughly Nikolai had dismantled a rival, understanding the message he'd sent about what happened to anyone who touched what was his. Marcus stayed in the estate, recovering physically while something else in him struggled to heal. I'd catch him sometimes staring at his bandaged hands, or looking out windows at Moscow, like he was seeing it for the first time. Really seeing it without the romantic filter of excitement and possibility he'd worn before. He was quiet in ways he'd never been, subdued in ways that scared me more than his recklessness ever had. "I almost got you killed," he said one afternoon when we were both sitting in the library, the Moscow rain making gray rivers down the windows. "I thought I was being smart, thought I understood how this world worked, but I was just a kid playing at being dangerous." "You were desperate," I said, because what else could I say? We both were. We both made choices we thought would save us. Did they? He looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they had a month ago. Save us, I mean. I didn't have an answer for that. We were alive, which counted for something. Mama's medical bills were paid, which counted for more. But we traded one kind of desperation for another, had sold pieces of ourselves to stay afloat. And I wasn't sure yet if that trade had been worth it. Nikolai gave Marcus a choice after 2 weeks of recovery. Go back to Detroit with enough money to start clean, to build a legitimate life, to never touch this world again. Or stay in Moscow, work for the organization in ways that didn't involve violence or risk, earn his place honestly instead of through desperation. Marcus chose to stay, not because he was hungry for power anymore, but because leaving felt like running, and he'd spent too much of his life running from consequences. He wanted to prove, to himself more than anyone, that he could be better than his worst choices. I understood that. God, did I understand that. Nikolai and I existed in a strange space after everything that had happened. The violence had bound us tighter, made the connection between us undeniable and complex and terrifying in its intensity. He looked at me sometimes like he couldn't quite believe I was real, would reach out to touch me like he needed physical confirmation that I was still there, still alive, still his. We didn't talk about what came next. Talking would mean confronting the impossibility of us. A black woman from Detroit and the butcher of Moscow, a former maid and a pakhan, someone who'd killed once and someone who'd killed more times than he could count. We just existed in the present, in the space between who we'd been and who we were becoming. But Moscow had other plans. Moscow always had other plans. The meeting came from an unexpected source, Nikolai's mother, who I'd heard about but never met, who'd been living in a dacha outside the city for the past 5 years, and apparently had opinions about her son's choice in women. "She wants to see you," Nikolai said one evening, his voice carefully neutral in a way that made me nervous. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? With my mother, it is never simple. He sat down beside me on the couch, his hand finding mine. She is traditional, old world. She believes in the way things have always been done. So she's going to hate me. She is going to judge you, he corrected. Whether she hates you depends on whether you pass her tests. Tests, great, because this wasn't complicated enough already. But I agreed to go because refusing would have been its own kind of statement, would have been hiding or running, and I was trying to be done with both of those things. So 3 days later, I found myself in a car driving into the countryside outside Moscow, watching the city give way to forests and snow that hadn't quite finished melting, heading toward a woman who might decide I wasn't worthy of her son. The dacha was beautiful in an understated way, wooden and traditional, surrounded by birch trees that glowed white against the dark earth. Nikolai's mother was waiting on the porch, a woman in her 60s with ice-pale eyes like her son and a spine that had never bent for anyone. She looked at me like I was a problem she needed to solve, her gaze traveling from my face to my hands to the way I stood beside Nikolai. She spoke in rapid Russian, her tone clipped and assessing. Nikolai responded in the same language, his voice firm but respectful. They went back and forth while I stood there understanding maybe half of it, catching words like American and improper and tradition. Finally, she turned to me and spoke in heavily accented English. "You are the one who took the bullet for my son." "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "Why?" It was a simple question that demanded a complicated answer. I thought about all the things I could say, about instinct, about seeing the red dot, about not having time to think. But what came out was just the truth. because the world felt wrong with him about to die in it. Something flickered in her cold eyes. She studied me for a long moment, then said something to Nikolai in Russian that made him nod. Then she turned and walked into the dacha, leaving us to follow. The afternoon that followed was surreal. She made tea the traditional way, served it in glasses with sugar cubes, and asked me questions about my life, my family, my intentions toward her son. Not in a warm way. Her tone stayed assessing, clinical, like she was interviewing me for a position. But she listened to my answers, really listened, and sometimes she'd translate for Nikolai when I struggled with Russian words I didn't know yet. "You are not what I expected," she said finally when the tea was gone and the afternoon light was starting to fade. "You are not soft, not weak, not trying to be something you are not." "I don't know how to be anything other than myself," I said honestly. "Good." She looked at Nikolai, said something in Russian that made his jaw tighten, then back to me. "My son has been alone for a long time. He has built walls around himself, has become the monster everyone expects him to be. But I see how he looks at you. Like you are the only thing in the world that matters." "Mother," Nikolai started, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I am old, Kolya. I am allowed to speak truth." She turned back to me, her pale eyes softening slightly. "You have made him human again. That is a gift and a burden. Can you carry both?" The weight of that question sat heavy in my chest. Could I carry loving a man who killed, who ruled through fear, who would always have enemies circling? Could I carry being the soft spot in his armor, the vulnerability he'd die to protect? Could I carry choosing this world, this life, this impossible love over the safety and normalcy I'd once dreamed of? "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm willing to try." She nodded, something like approval in her expression. That is all anyone can promise, the trying. We left as evening fell, Moscow's lights visible in the distance like stars brought down to earth. Nikolai was quiet during the drive, his hand on my thigh, his thumb rubbing small circles through the fabric of my dress. "What did she say to you?" I asked finally. "At the end, in Russian. She said that if I let you go, she would never forgive me." His voice was rough with emotion he was trying to control. "She said you were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was a fool if I didn't realize it. Your mother is very direct." "Yes." He glanced at me, something vulnerable in his expression. "She is also very rarely wrong." We drove in silence for a while, Moscow getting closer, the weight of everything we hadn't said sitting between us like a third passenger. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "What are we doing, Nikolai?" I asked quietly. "What is this, really? Am I your... what? Girlfriend seems too small. Prisoner seems too harsh. I don't even know what to call myself anymore." He pulled the car over to the side of the road, put it in park, and turned to face me fully. His pale eyes caught the light from passing cars, and his expression was more open than I'd ever seen it. "In my world, we have a word," he said carefully. "Jana. It means wife, but it also means more. It means the person who stands beside you, who knows all your darkness and chooses you anyway, who is protected by your name and your power and your willingness to burn the world for them." My heart was beating too fast, too hard. "Are you?" "I am asking you to stay," he said, his accent thick with intensity. "Not as someone who works for me or someone I protect. As my equal, my partner, my..." He struggled for the English word, then gave up and said it in Russian. "Moya Zhena, my wife." The proposal hung in the air between us, impossible and inevitable at the same time. I thought about all the reasons I should say no. The violence, the danger, the impossibility of building a life with a man who had enemies everywhere and blood on his hands. Thought about Mama back in Detroit, about what she'd say if she knew I was considering marrying into the Russian Mafia. Thought about the girl I'd been 6 months ago, who'd believed in normal futures and safe choices. But I also thought about how he'd stayed by my bedside for 3 days. How he'd taught me Russian with patience I didn't know he had. How he'd made me visible in a world designed to keep me invisible. Thought about how he'd gone to war for me, how he'd given me the choice to pull the trigger or not, how he looked at me like I was the only thing between him and the darkness he'd lived in so long. I need to call my mother, I said finally. Tell her the truth about where I am, what I'm doing, who you are. No more lies. Agreed. I need Marcus to be safe. Real safe, not just protected because of me safe. He will be, I swear it. And I paused, trying to find words for something I barely understood myself. I need to still be me, not some version of myself that fits better into your world. Just me. Nikolai reached out, cupped my face in his tattooed hands, and looked at me with an intensity that stole my breath. I do not want you to be anyone except exactly who you are. That is why I am asking. Because you are brave and stubborn and too smart to lie to. Because you see the monster and you do not run. Because you make me want to be better than I am. You make me want to be braver than I am, I whispered back. Then be brave with me. His forehead rested against mine, his breath warm on my lips. Say yes. Stay. Be mine as I am yours. I thought about cages and freedom, about how sometimes the biggest risk is not taking a leap, but staying safely on solid ground. Thought about how love wasn't supposed to be safe or simple, or anything other than the terrifying, exhilarating choice to bind yourself to another person despite knowing it might destroy you both. Yes, I said in Russian, then in English. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'm yours. He kissed me then, deep and claiming and full of promise, and I kissed him back with everything I had, all the fear and hope and desperate love I'd been trying to pretend I didn't feel. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pulled a ring from his pocket. It was simple but beautiful, a single diamond set in white gold, traditional but not ostentatious. The kind of ring that said forever without shouting it. He slid it onto my finger, and it fit perfectly, like he'd known my size without asking, like he'd been carrying it waiting for the right moment. When? I asked, looking at the ring catching light from passing cars. When you are ready, he said. A week, a month, a year. I am patient when it matters. We drove back to Moscow as an engaged couple, the words strange and wonderful and terrifying on my tongue. The estate felt different when we arrived, like it had transformed from a place I was staying into a place I was choosing, a home instead of a cage. The wedding happened 3 months later, after I'd called Mama and explained everything, who Nikolai was, what his world entailed, how I'd fallen in love with a man who scared most people just by existing. She cried, of course, yelled at me for being reckless, for throwing away opportunities, for choosing danger over safety. But then she asked to video chat with him, and I watched Nikolai, the butcher of Moscow, the man who killed more people than he could count, sit nervously in front of my laptop and let my mother interrogate him about his intentions toward her daughter. He answered every question honestly, told her about the violence in his life, about the risks, about how he'd do everything in his power to keep me safe, but couldn't make promises about a world that didn't operate on promises. Told her he loved me in his rough, accented English, the words clearly uncomfortable in his mouth, but no less true for the discomfort. Mama looked at him for a long time after he finished. Then she said, "You hurt my baby, and I don't care how many men you have or how many guns you own. I will find a way to hurt you back. We clear?" Nikolai actually smiled. "Yes, ma'am. Very clear." She couldn't come to the wedding. The travel was too much, her health still fragile. But Marcus stood beside me as I married Nikolai in a small ceremony at an Orthodox church in Moscow. The priest blessed us with holy water and incense, the words ancient and beautiful, even though I only understood half of them. Nikolai's men filled the pews, along with the other pakhons who'd come to witness the butcher of Moscow, taking a wife, making official what everyone already knew. I wore white because Nikolai had insisted, a dress that was simple and elegant and nothing like the elaborate gowns I'd imagined as a girl. His mother cried, which shocked everyone, including Nikolai. His bratva toasted us with vodka and speeches in Russian that made grown men laugh or looking away with wet eyes. And through it all, Nikolai held my hand like he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go. Looked at me like I'd given him something he'd stopped believing existed. The reception was held at the estate, and it was there, surrounded by criminals and killers, toasting our happiness with stolen champagne, that I finally understood what I'd chosen. Not safety or normalcy or the life I'd planned, but something messier and more real. A love that had been forged through violence and blood and choices that couldn't be unmade. A partnership with a man who was equal parts monster and human, who I'd chosen with my eyes wide open to both. Regrets? Nikolai asked me late in the evening, when most of the guests had either left or passed out drunk, when it was just us dancing slowly to music from a string quartet he'd hired. About 100, I admitted, but not about you. Never about you. Good, he said, his arms tightening around me, because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you never do. The years that followed were not easy. Violence followed us like a shadow, rival organizations, testing boundaries, internal betrayals that needed to be handled, the constant threat of law enforcement, or enemies, or just bad luck. I learned to live with fear as a constant companion, learned to shoot and plan and think 3 steps ahead, learned that loving someone in this world meant accepting that every goodbye might be the last one, that every kiss might be stolen. But there were beautiful moments too. Mornings waking up tangled in Nikolai's arms, his face soft in sleep, the monster replaced temporarily by just a man who loved me, teaching his men English and having them teach me more Russian until I was fluent in both languages. Video calls with Mama where she'd complain about Detroit weather and tell me about Marcus's latest girlfriend. Watching my brother slowly transform from a desperate kid into a man who understood the weight of choices and made better ones. Nikolai changed too, slowly and subtly. The brutality was still there. You don't survive as Bahan by going soft. But there was more consideration in his decisions, more thought given to consequences beyond just winning. His men noticed, started calling him the reformed butcher behind his back, until he overheard and laughed instead of threatening them. His mother visited more often, her ice slowly thawing into something like acceptance of the life her son had chosen and the woman he'd chosen to share it with. 2 years after the wedding, I got pregnant. The news sent Nikolai into a spiral of fear and protection that would have been funny if it hadn't been so intense. He tripled security, hired a full medical team to be on call 24/7, nearly drove me insane with his hovering, until I threatened to move back to Detroit until he could act like a rational human being. "I cannot lose you," he said one night when I'd found him sitting in the nursery we were preparing, his head in his hands. "You or this child, I cannot—" His voice broke, and I saw the fear beneath the monster, the man who'd lost so much in his life and was terrified of losing more. "You won't," I said, sitting beside him, taking his tattooed hands in mine. "We're fighters, remember? All 3 of us, and we're not going anywhere." Our daughter was born on a snowy January morning, screaming and perfect and utterly unimpressed by her father's reputation. We named her Anastasia, Anna for short, and watching Nikolai hold her for the first time, this tiny person who depended on him completely, I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Pure, uncomplicated joy. "She has your eyes," he said softly, his finger tracing her tiny cheek. "Your beautiful eyes." "And your stubbornness, I'm betting," I replied. He looked up at me then, his pale eyes wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. "Thank you," he said in Russian, "for this, for her, for choosing to stay when you should have run." "Thank you for giving me a reason to stay," I replied in the same language. The years continued to unfold, messy and violent and beautiful in equal measure. Anna grew up bilingual and strong, learning to navigate her father's world with a grace that terrified and impressed me. Marcus eventually fell in love with a Russian woman who worked in Nikolai's legitimate businesses, someone who understood the life without being consumed by it. Mama's health stabilized enough that she finally visited Moscow, meeting her granddaughter and grudgingly admitting that maybe I'd made a choice that worked, even if it wasn't the one she'd have chosen for me. And Nikolai and I, we built something. Not perfect, not simple, but real. A partnership forged in blood and choice, and the stubborn refusal to let violence be the only story we told. Some nights I still woke up from nightmares about the kidnapping, about the moment I'd pulled the trigger, about all the ways this could have gone wrong. But Nikolai would be there, pulling me against his chest, reminding me that we'd survived, that we were still surviving, that love in this world wasn't about the absence of darkness, but about finding someone willing to stand in it with you. Looking back now, years later, I can see the girl I was when I stepped off that plane, naive and desperate, and believing invisibility was the same as safety. I can see all the moments that led me here, all the choices that seemed impossible at the time, but became inevitable in retrospect. The red laser dot, the bullet, the kiss, the proposal, the wedding, the daughter, the life I never planned but somehow built anyway. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the truth about my life, whether I regret it, whether I wish I'd stayed invisible, stayed safe, gone back to Detroit and found some normal life with a normal man. And I tell them the truth, I regret plenty. Regret the violence I've seen and participated in. Regret the innocence I lost and can never reclaim. Regret that my daughter will grow up knowing her father is feared, that she'll have to carry that weight. But I don't regret him. Don't regret loving a monster who became human for me, who showed me that survival sometimes means choosing danger over safety, that bravery is just fear walking forward anyway. Don't regret the woman I became in his bed, in his world, in his arms, someone who knows her own strength, who refuses to be invisible, who took a bullet and lived to tell the story. I was just his black maid until I took a bullet for him. Now I'm the woman who owns the man who owns Russia. And somehow, impossibly, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The red laser was just the beginning. Everything after, the blood and the love and the life we built from violence and choice, that was us deciding that some things are worth bleeding for, worth risking everything for, worth choosing even when every rational part of you screams to run. I stayed. God help me, I stayed, and I'd make the same choice again every single time. And that's the story. That's how she fell for Moscow's most dangerous man and lived to tell the tale.